Short people. Hello, I'm Sharon Allen. I'm a combat veteran of the Iraq War, where I was an E5 sergeant in the Ohio Army National Guard. I'm also the chaplain of the Dexness Keenan VFW, spokesperson for American Veterans Forum, and a proud member of both the Canaryville Veterans Association and the Canaryville Motorcycle Association. I was called up for my second mobilization in 2004, this time to serve with the 216th Engineer Battalion, Combat Heavy, under the 1st Infantry Division, stationed in Saddam's hometown of Tikrit, Iraq. I had been working full-time for the National Guard as a wheeled vehicle mechanic, but my primary MOS, or Mission Military Occupational Specialty, was petroleum supply. That job doesn't really exist in the States, but is pretty important overseas, and it's considered a critical MOS. See, to become a petroleum supply specialist, you have to score at least an 85% on the ASVAB, so you have to be relatively intelligent. But you also have to be stupid enough to voluntarily drive a moving bomb in a combat zone, so there are not many of us. In fact, when I got called up in 2004, I was the last one left in the state of Ohio. My first glimpse of my new Hemet fuel truck was at Fob Spiker in Tikrit, Iraq. It looked pretty much like any other fuel truck you'd see on the streets here today if it was a truck built in the 50s. There was no armor because this was many months before Rumsfeld said that all of our trucks were up-armored, and many more months before any of them actually were. And when I first got a look at it, on the side of the truck, in 80 million point type, it says, "Flammable." And then it even has one of the OSHA placards with the flames on it, just in case they couldn't read or they couldn't see my green truck, in the middle of the not green desert. So the first thing I did when I got to Iraq was rip that placard off of my truck. The second thing I did was report to my first sergeant for destruction of government property. To his credit, my first sergeant informed my overzealous E7 that I had the shortest life expectancy for the entire battalion, and I was to be given carte blanche to do whatever I wanted to that truck. So I grabbed a rattle can of spray paint, and for the next 11 months, I drove a Hemet fueler that said, "Milk." That's true. My A driver was the only other female in the platoon. There were a total of 4 women in my company of about 130 or 140 soldiers. I don't usually mention this, though, when I'm talking about Iraq, because I don't really want my gender to be my story. But the reason why the Freedom Run asked me to speak today is because this year they wanted to specifically honor women in the military, which is pretty awesome. So today I'm going to talk about women in the military. 1.853 million veterans are women. We comprise about 15% of the current fighting force. So that's 350,000 currently serving, about 210,000 on active duty, and one of those is a 4-star general. The guys in my platoon, though, they didn't really have a problem with the fact that Kim and I were female. They had a problem that we were Yankees, because Bravo Company was from Portsmouth, Ohio, which is just this side of West Virginia. There's nothing there but a prison and a power plant, and my platoon worked at the prison. They chewed tobacco and had mustaches, and for about 3 months, I couldn't understand a word they said. And I went to college in Tennessee, so I was pretty used to talking, to Southerners. But these guys, they could have been the wind talkers of the Iraq War. There's no way that the most educated Arab could have cracked their code. And they were South will rise again type boys, So on the foot of my cot, I posted a sign that said, "The North shall maintain victory." They didn't find that nearly as funny as I did. They were horizontal engineers, and I soon got the hang of bulldozers, loaders, scrapers, and graders when I figured out that conducting mobile fueling operations in a combat zone is not only dangerous, but also death-defyingly boring. So instead of sitting in the sweltering tent waiting for the guys to come back, I jumped on a D7 Cat and pushed some dirt. I got enough hours to get the secondary MOS of heavy equipment operator, which is also critical. And I always get really angry when people insinuate that service members aren't very intelligent. And then I think about the fact that I intentionally came home a single sergeant with no kids and 2 critical MOSs and a time of 2 wars with 3 years left on my contract. And I think they might have a point. We traveled around building and improving the force protection of existing forward operating bases. We'd build roads and berms, fill HESCOs, and set concrete T-walls and Jersey barriers. Our living conditions varied considerably by camp. Some of them were pretty bad, and others were really bad. Fob Spiker was the best. It was an old Iraqi military base, so we actually had 4 walls and a roof there. But everywhere else, we were only visitors. So our living conditions were an afterthought at best. We lived in bombed out buildings, airplane hangars, trailers, tents. Sometimes we slept outside. But Kim and I went on the same missions, on the same convoys, and slept in the same tents with the guys. We ate the same food, and we lacked the exact same amenities. In fact, one time, we were really crammed in these tents, too. There'd be 24 of us in a 14-man tent. And my cot was always next to Wiley's cot. And we were living out of duffel bags. So inevitably, our stuff would get commingled. And one time, there was this brown T-shirt, half on my cot and half on his. I said, "Wiley, is that my shirt or yours?" And he picks it up, and he smells it, and he goes, "It's yours." For those of you who have not had the joy of living in the field, he was not smelling Downy freshness right there. He was not smelling my shampoo. He actually knew my scent. We would be sent on 2 to 3 day missions that would last 3 weeks, and we'd only have 1 uniform. I guess sweat is actually kind of like a natural starch. We could make our jackets stand up all night. It was kind of amazing. And eventually, when we couldn't stand anymore, we would hand wash our uniforms, which hand washing and drying your uniforms in Iraq, research proves that that's the #1 way to attract sandstorms. So then you get to walk around in sandpaper until you get back to Spiker. They don't show you that on the recruiting videos. But this is not what you want to hear about. I know what you want to hear about. Yes, the camel spiders were huge. Too small to shoot, but too big to stomp. Seriously, just, stomping on one would just make it angry. And even though a camel spider in and of itself wasn't that bad, an angry camel spider was downright terrifying. And if you could feel something watching you and you turn around and it's a spider the size of your fist, you want that to be a happy spider. So our living conditions left a lot to be desired. And it was uncomfortable, but it was also somehow comforting. Because I remember laying there in my cot, covered with a glaze of sweat and ever-present grit in my teeth and dirt up my nose and trying to sleep amid the snores and farts and screams from the guy with the night terrors. But I also remember that I felt safe. I slept safely every single night in Iraq. So I knew I might die that night. I mean, we got rocketed and mortared all the time. But I would not die alone. I don't want to die alone. I don't want to die naked. So I was good in Iraq because that wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't actually until I was home in my apartment in Cincinnati that I was terrified to go to sleep because I was all alone. And I cannot overemphasize just how not alone I was. At some of these camps, we didn't have any bathroom facilities whatsoever. You always had to be in somebody's line of sight. And sometimes we were stuck in a C-130 for 3 hours, and they just have a little tube thing, They don't have bathroom facilities for women on a C-130. So people always ask me, what was the hardest thing about being a woman in a combat zone? And it was learning how to pee standing up. Okay, right now I want to address a strangely common misconception about women in combat. My uterus is not a force field. If it were, we would have an all-female military. I have to point this out because all the time people are telling me, well, you couldn't have been in any danger. You're a woman. I'm like, yes, I'm a woman. I'm not Wonder Woman. My battalion had the lowest casualty rate for any battalion at that time with comparably dangerous missions. We were very lucky. We did road sanitation. Road sanitation sounds so innocuous, but what that is when you clear the debris off the streets to make it harder for them to hide improvised explosive devices. If you happen to find some in the process, that's just a bonus. One day, in one day, my platoon found 7 IEDs. And we didn't find them with the aid of a bomb squad. We found them with a bulldozer and with a grader. For comparison, though, there was something else called QRF, which is Quick Reaction Force. And those were the guys you called if you spilled something and you needed it cleaned up really quickly. So I figured out that a mission's danger was inversely proportional to how hardcore it sounded. And I would gladly volunteer for like Operation Dragon Blade Deathfire, because that was like teaching patty cake to kids. But I didn't want anything to do with Operation Care Bear Stare. But as I said, we were very lucky. I only know 3 names on this wall. Private First Class Sam Bowen, he did his first tour in his 20s, and then he re-upped after the attacks on the World Trade Center, and he became the 1,000th casualty since 9/11 when he was killed by a rocket-propelled grenade. Private First Class Ryan Martin, he wasn't afraid to go to Iraq, but he was afraid to fly there because he'd never been on a plane. And First Lieutenant Charles Wilkins was actually with me on both of my mobilizations. The last 2 died doing road sanitation. But it could have been any of us. In World War II, 416,837 Americans died in the line of duty. 543 of them were women, but only 16 of those were killed by enemy fire. In the Korean War, at least 36,516 Americans were killed, 17 of them female nurses. In the Vietnam War, at least 58,282 Americans were killed, 8 were women, 1 from enemy fire. And from there, the percentages increased dramatically. Only 148 Americans died during Operation Desert Storm, but 15 of them were women. 2,229 Americans have been killed in the war in Afghanistan. 45 of them are women. In Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation New Dawn, 4,475 Americans have been killed, and 110 of them were women. So while women comprised only 0.01% of American casualties in Vietnam, they are 2.45% of American casualties in Iraq. That is a 24,500% increase in 1 generation, maybe 2. There are 8 women on the Vietnam Wall. Major Jamie Elizabeth Leonard was killed by small arms fire in Afghanistan on June 8th during her 3rd combat tour. Once her name is added, there will be 170 on this one. Women are fighting and dying for our country. 977 women have been wounded in action in the global war on terror. But throughout this nation's history, women have won the Distinguished Service Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Soldier's Medal, the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star for Valor, the Silver Star, and the Medal of Honor. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage can apply to members of both sexes. At one point, I was the only woman in my platoon because Kim was home on leave. They tried to hold me back from the mission because it was on the border of Iran, and a kidnapped American female was worth more money than an American male. At the beginning of my tour, I was reportedly worth $1 million. By the time I came home, it was 2 women for $500,000. I depreciated worse than a Honda. But I wouldn't let them hold me back. And they couldn't hold me back anyway because there was no qualified male fueler. And the Army said I could drive that fuel truck, then I was going to drive that fuel truck wherever that fuel truck was driven. And as it turns out, that mission was the best mission of my entire tour. I was the first and only woman at Forward Operating Base Kalsu in Kurdistan, and the Kurds love us. The Kurdish soldiers were part of a militia called the Peshmerga. They've been our allies since Desert Storm, probably before. Peshmerga literally means those who face death. So I'm not saying that these guys are any less violent than the Arabs. I'm not saying that they were blameless in the bad blood between the two. All I'm saying is they didn't want to kill me, so we were totally BFFs. The Kurds were mainly Christian, and their women could wear pants and drive cars and go to college. They could even be in the militia. But they still didn't operate bulldozers, so I was quite a novelty for the Kurds. I was invited to lunch frequently by the officers in the Peshmerga, and I soon became hopelessly addicted to their chai, which is this super sugary hot tea that they brew over an open fire. It's like liquid crack. One of my guys had a guitar, and we'd go around to the guard shacks, and he'd play music for them for the crack, you know. The Kurds knew Michael Jackson, Shakira, and Monica Lewinsky. They asked about her all the time. Eventually, I became conversational in Surani Kurdish. On convoys, I'd yell, Hazm la Kurdistana, at all the checkpoints. But just until we got far enough south to get in Arab country, because, I love Kurdistan, would just get you shot twice. The Arabs also found me to be a bit of a novelty. They really didn't give me too much trouble. The women we saw down there did wear burqas, but they didn't expect me to. Not that it would have mattered, but I worked with the Arabs on the job sites, and I escorted them on and off the fob. Kim and I did our best not to emasculate or embarrass the men if we could help it, because that wasn't going to make our jobs any easier. But we also had to make sure that we didn't come across as weak and that they didn't think that they could get us to stop that fuel truck for any reason. Because a moving bomb is one thing, a stationary bomb is entirely different. So whenever a white Toyota pickup truck would try to, would refuse to yield right away, we would just take right away until word spread among the village that those American girls are crazy and they will run you over. Then we didn't have any more problems. But I know this war, the women in war thing is uncomfortable for some Americans as well. As I said, I'm the chaplain of my VFW, and it is a decidedly older crowd. Over half of the regularly attending members are 50 years older than me. I'm 35. Some of them may think that women shouldn't be in the military. They may think that they would feel the need to protect the women, or the women couldn't, hold their share. And that's okay with me, because these men, they didn't train with me. They didn't serve with me. Just don't expect me to care about your opinion about women in the military unless you've been in the military with women. But these octogenarians still elected a chaplain who wears a skirt, so I give them a lot of credit. They're really trying. Right now, as a civilian, I work as a heavy machinery mechanic. I'm the first and only woman in my union, and I was hired against the wishes of many of them. Less than a year later, I was a steward, and I've twice been nominated for chairman. The guys had no problem with me once I proved myself. And that's the thing about the military. You just get so many chances to prove yourself. I was the only expert machine gunner in the company, and I was a combat lifesaver. You could ask any man in my platoon, and he would tell you that I had his back just as much as he had mine. It was still very much a boys' club, though. At that field artillery camp in Kurdistan, they named their vehicles after porn stars. But this didn't offend me. I was like, I don't care if you fuel up Alpha 14 or Jenna Jameson. I don't care. And one of the coolest things that happened out there was when the WWE wrestlers came out for Christmas. We were all well entrenched in our end-of-tour paranoia while gearing up for the first Iraqi elections. It was a very tense time. But those wrestlers made us forget all about it. You had to picture this, though. We are in Saddam's son's soccer stadium. There is a flag the size of Connecticut hanging over where Qusay used to sit. In the middle of this soccer stadium is a wrestling ring, and Mick Foley is dressed up as Santa Claus. Can you get any more American than that? And then the first matchup that came out, the guy came out waving a French flag. He lost. It was awesome. I hadn't followed wrestling since like Jake the Snake and Rowdy Roddy Piper. But I'll tell you what, when I heard the gong and the Undertaker came out, I about lost it. But the divas were there too in these little red fur bikinis. And one of the guys turns to me and he goes, "Does that offend you?" And I said, "What? That they're half naked? So are the wrestlers. I'm good." But it is interesting to live in such a testosterone-fueled world. Here's a good example of the idiocy I lived with at times. Before you deploy, you have to go through the gas chamber. It's ostensibly to prove that your gas mask works, but it really is just a sadistic way for your superiors to have some fun with you. And I know it's sadistic because at every single gas chamber I've ever been to, there's a huge tree right outside the door. Because you're supposed to exit calmly and quietly. Well, you've just been riot gassed. You're going to run out that door and you run right into the tree. So the first time I'm mobilized, I'm in a maintenance platoon, so we go first. We go through the gas chamber, come out coughing up a spleen, sliming everywhere. The other 3 platoons go through, and then my guys decide they want to do it again. This is riot gas, okay? So I very rarely buy into the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing, but I guarantee you that never in the history of all time has a woman decided that the best way to demonstrate how much estrogen she had was to suck on some CS gas. But as stupid as it was, that was my platoon and those were my guys. So when they went back through, I went right back through with them. But my Ohio unit loved me. But when I came back from the war and I moved to Chicago, Illinois had no place for me. My job was not open to women in this state. I had to fulfill the rest of my enlistment in Gary, Indiana. I'm a combat veteran, but I'm still afraid of Gary, Indiana. I was like, can I hang on to my M16 just a little bit longer? Because the Illinois units were combat engineer. In Indiana, I could be engineer combat heavy. See, apparently, like, my fallopian tubes make it harder to tie deck cord. But they taught me how to anyway. They sent me to school for it. So I'm playing with C4 at Fort Leonard Wood, and I asked the instructor, I said, why are you teaching me something I'm not allowed to do? And he said, we know you do it. We can give you all the training. I just can't give you the official designation. It's kind of like how women aren't supposed to be on the front lines. I'll tell you what, we looked and looked, and Samara, Fallujah, and Najaf, and we never did find that front line. That's why I'm glad that Leon Panetta opened up combat roles for women. It's because we're already doing them, just without the recognition. But everything I heard for like a week after that announcement was, guess what, Sharon? Now you can go to war. Well, where the hell do you think I was in 2004? You see, the military has no problem with women in the military. My command sergeant major was a woman. A very, very scary woman. And in 8 years in the National Guard, I only met one man who had a problem with me just because I was a woman. Had he taken the time to get to know me, he would have found many better reasons to dislike me. But it was that guy that reported me to my first sergeant, my first day in Iraq. On that day, he was an E7, Sergeant First Class. I was an E4, Specialist. We both came home E5s. The Army was good to me. And I know, I'm 6 foot tall and 202 pounds. I am bigger than most women. I am bigger than most men. However, Kim is 5 foot tall and 118 pounds. She carried her ruck and pulled her weight just like any man. Granted, she is now a mixed martial arts cage fighter. The other two Bravo Company girls were both about 5'3". Sergeant Deb Charles was a former Marine Staff Sergeant, and Sergeant Ada Milby was a fitness instructor who one time picked up Shannon Bear, who weighed 240 pounds and was 6'3", threw him over her shoulder, and just walked away with him. But you might think that the Bravo Company girls are just the exception to the rule, so let me tell you about Alpha Company. Specialist Ashley Van Sickle never saw a weapon she didn't want to fire. She volunteered for the gun truck on every single convoy that came up. She vastly preferred the 50 cal because, as she said, you can't lay down suppressive fire with a Mark 19, and she really liked laying down suppressive fire. And Specialist Rachel McAdams was the most aggressive driver this side of NASCAR. So maybe we're not the exception. Maybe the rule has changed. I want to finish by telling you about my homecoming, but I have to warn you that I very rarely get through this without crying, and I do not cry with sophistication and dignity. It's basically like snot everywhere, but I'm going to try to keep this together, but I apologize in advance if this gets a little ugly. When it was time to come home, I had the option of hitching a ride with HSC, which was based out of my hometown of Cincinnati. Instead, I chose to ride home with my company to Portsmouth. I'd grown quite close to the men in my platoon. I even talked with an accent. I went to war and came home a redneck. Portsmouth was farther from our demobilization station than Cincinnati, so the HSC soldiers got home before we did. And my cell phone's ringing, and people are telling me all about this glorious homecoming they're witnessing in Cincinnati. They had fire trucks and police cruisers, ambulances, all lights on, sirens blaring, a professional parade all the way through the heart of the city. Meanwhile, Bravo Company is in 3 decommissioned Greyhound buses limping along down a dusty one-lane road. One lane. The only waves we'd gotten were the middle finger kind because we were taking up too much of the one-lane road. It was February, it was cold, it was bleak, gray skies streaked with these apathetic clouds. Then about 30 miles outside of Portsmouth, we passed 7 motorcycles on the side of the road. This was our escort. They had the flags, they had American flags and the POW flag, and they took us all the way in. About 10 miles outside town, we started to see people waving at us, some holding flags. About 5 miles outside of town, the crowd started to swell. And there were flags hanging from cranes and signs everywhere. There was styrofoam cups and a chain link fence that said, "Bravo Company, got her done." They'd even let the prisoners out in the yard and they were waving at their prison guards. And if anybody ever wanted to commit a crime in Portsmouth, that was the day to do it, because there were police officers, VFW members, American Legion members, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts at every single street corner standing there saluting us. I was later told that there were more people on the sides of the streets than the entire population of Portsmouth. It was grander than anything they could have done in Cincinnati. I'll never forget those 7 bikers. It was just amazing. And it's amazing what all of you do. I have 2 motorcycles. I have a 2007 Harley-Davidson Super Glide Custom and a 2012 Euro Solo. I probably wouldn't have them if it wasn't for some people who are here today. I went to a funeral for a soldier who was from Bridgeport who was killed in Iraq. Afterwards, I met the Freedom Run guys. I met Jerry and Johnny and Chuck and Dale. And later I met everybody else. And I didn't know the soldier who had died, but neither did they. And they showed up to a funeral for somebody they had no connection to. And I just thought that was amazing. Later, I met the people from Avra, the Legion Riders, the Patriot Guard, the Lawmen, the Canaryville Motorcycle Association, all of whom escort soldiers home, whether it's to an armory or to a cemetery. They, along with members of the Morris VFW Honor Guard and others, have made it part of their mission to give funeral honors to indigent and homeless veterans. Recently, it was discovered that some of these homeless veterans are being buried in cardboard boxes, and they are now talking with members of Congress to rectify this. Tommy Russell is the president of the Canaryville Motorcycle Association, and he sums it up nicely. He says, "They served with honor, they deserve to be buried with dignity." And that's amazing. So I just want to thank all of you and the motorcycle community, because you mean it when you say that you won't forget. You make sure that my generation gets the welcome home that the ones before mine did not, that some of you out here did not. So, on behalf of all veterans of the Middle East conflicts, I want to thank you for giving us all a homecoming and for giving us this wall for my friends and all the other soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who gave their lives in defense of this country. Thank you.
Our keynote speaker, Army Sergeant Sharon Allen.